Hello everybody, I'm Brent Manning with Riverbend Malt House, and we're here at Oak and Grist Distilling in Black Mountain, North Carolina. And today we're going to take a quick little tour, and then we're going to do a whiskey tasting here with the head distiller, Will Goldberg. And we thought we'd kind of start off with a quick explanation of how Will and his team craft their spirits. Will, why don't you tell us what you're standing in front of here?
This is Ethel. She's our 250-gallon copper pot still. She's alembic in design, so you can see she's got that round base and that narrow tapering neck. That's a very old design situated to produce whiskey to its highest potential, so to speak. Yeah, we are the area's only 100% grain to glass distillery, so everything that goes into Oak and Grist bottles is brewed, fermented, distilled, and when appropriate, aged right here in this facility that surrounds me. You know, one of the biggest misconceptions that we get from visitors is people don't realize that in order to make whiskey, you have to brew a beer. And so that's one of the first pieces of education that we put out there to folks is to my left is sort of the brewing side of things. We've got our mash tun, we've got our fermenter, or our fermenters, and that's sort of that initial piece. That's where we bring in the malt from Riverbend Malt House, and we get the process going from there. We've got to create alcohol in order to turn it into whiskey. And whiskey can only ever be made from grain, and the type of grain that you start with dictates what you end up with. So we were founded as a grain to glass distillery. My mentor is a retired master distiller from Scotland. So we set out to craft a regionally inspired single malt whiskey, and the key word there is regionally. And so for me, with a background in agriculture, I couldn't have done it any other way than partnering with local farms and with a local malt house in order to create the products that we've released so far to date. So nice. We do both gin and whiskey. And again, all that is done right here on Ethel through a series of fermentations and distillations.
Yeah, well, Will, I know we're going to concentrate on whiskey today, but definitely tell us a bit more about how the gin comes together, because I think it's a pretty distinctive product.
Yeah, so we make a very different style of gin than what most folks are used to. We're all relatively familiar with London Dry style gin. We make a Geneva style gin, which is the original Dutch version of gin. And basically, the main thing that means is that rather than using a vodka as the base for our gin, like London Dries do, we use our whiskey as the base for London Dries. So no matter what, when we're making whiskey, we do a double distillation. So that means our spirit passes through the still twice. Then if we're turning our whiskey into gin, once we have the whiskey, we steep our 8 botanicals in that whiskey. We then redistill it through Ethel, as well as the column over there, Dr. Hooch, during a third distillation in order to create our dark rhythm gin. So it's got the result is a thicker mouthfeel with definitely some whiskey background notes, and then influenced by our local botanical selection.
Yeah, it's great, man. I always tell people, you know, it has more of a creamy mouthfeel than most of the other gins that I've tasted on the market. So I think that's a really neat differentiating factor, and that sounds like it's due in large part to the malt.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in all of our spirits, you know, the malt serves as that base profile, and actually even during fermentation, we're using fermentation techniques that are going to support and allow that malty profile to shine through in the final distilled product. So yeah, we're all about that local malt here at Oak and Grist.
Nice. Well, tell me a little bit, or tell everybody out there a little bit about where the American Single Malt movement stands right now. It seems like it's really gathering steam, and maybe tell us kind of how it differentiates itself from both, say, bourbon or a classic Scotch.
Yeah, so, you know, as I mentioned a moment ago, the main thing to understand when talking about the differences of whiskeys is it really does boil down to which grains you start with. So if you're starting with 51% corn, you're going to have a bourbon. 51% rye, you're going to have a rye whiskey. 100% malted barley is going to give you that malt whiskey. Now, I believe that in the United States, at least a 51% malt mash bill or grain bill is going to give you that malt designation. But here at Oak and Grist, we like to adhere to a little bit more of the Scottish standard, which is a little bit more defined, which requires 100% malted barley. In terms of sort of where American single malt stands, it's a burgeoning category within the spirits industry. The Scotch whiskey industry, that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years and is incredibly well established. But the American single malt whiskey category, which isn't even an official whiskey category yet, really has only been around for a couple decades. You know, you've got a few craft distilleries out there like St. George out of California that's got a pretty close, if not already, a 20 or a 30-year-old single malt whiskey. But wow, we're behind the times a little bit in terms of single malt production. So one of the things that's being worked on now is that the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission is working on getting a recognized definition for American single malt. It's going to have mostly to do with, as it looks like it's going to go through, mostly to do with where the whiskey is produced and what it is produced from. So it's going to be 100% malted barley. It's going to have to be produced in a single distillery entirely, so you're going to have to brew, ferment, and distill it, as well as age it in order to be considered as a single malt whiskey. It doesn't look like there's going to be an age requirement for American single malt whiskey. In Scotland, it's a minimum of 3 years to be considered a single malt, but that seems to be a little bit of a point of contention amongst producers. Because some folks are producing a tasty 10-month-old single malt, and some folks are producing a tasty 20-year-old single malt. So, yeah, you know, I think the question lies in where do you draw that line?
Because they kind of want that flexibility, right? They want to work with different size vessels. They want to work with different finishing barrels and all of that. So there's a real sort of don't fence me in with the creativity piece is really what they're trying to preserve there. So I think it's really cool. I mean, and the purpose of the movement is it needs that definition so that it can sort of live outside of the shadow of American bourbon and Tennessee whiskeys. Is that kind of where the movement kind of came from, and it needs its own space on the shelf kind of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think anytime an industry can better classify the subcategories within the industry, it's going to allow for a more informed consumer and a greater understanding of what's, when it comes to spirits, what's in our glass. So, you know, I think that, you know, just even to build the foundation to create education surrounding single malt whiskey, there's got to be a definition for it. Right. So, you know, I think that's a big push for it, as well as, you know, it's a pretty well-respected category, you know, everywhere outside of the United States. You know, sure, the U.S. has come to really embrace bourbon and to a certain extent rye whiskey. Sure. You know, but some of the first whiskeys that were probably made in this country were most likely a single malt whiskey because that's what the recipes coming over were. Sure. And then it transitioned into the new crops that were being cultivated in the young United States. So, you know, I think it's only natural that we sort of evolved to define subcategories as best we can so that, again, the consumer can just have as much information as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Got a little, so Copperworks fine-tuned it. You said, not required to brew, only distill and age in a single distillery.
Sounds good.
But yeah.
Thank you, Copperworks.
Yeah, very good stuff there. Appreciate the comment. So, yeah, well, man, that all sounds great. I guess without further ado, we should make our way into the tap room and taste some of these beauties that you got for us here.
Excellent.
Cool, man. All right, guys. So Will, tell us, while I'm setting up the light here, tell us what we're going to be tasting here today.
Yeah, so we are going to be tasting two of our relatively recent releases. We've got what we call a blended malt whiskey, which is basically our malt whiskey, our aged malt whiskey blended with a bit of our new make as a young spirit. To allow us to really showcase what that influence of the new make whiskey is. The blended malt series also works as our exploratory series, so it allows us to play around with different barrel types, different char levels, different amounts of time. It's really allowed us to gauge what our consumer is most interested in when it comes to our spirits. And then the other one is our inaugural single malt whiskey release. We just released it about 2 months ago to some pretty good reception. And what we decided to do with this is here at Oak and Grist is hold off on calling our malt whiskey single malt whiskey until we had hit that Scottish definition. So produced entirely here at the distillery. And aged for a minimum of 3 years. So this is a 3-year-old single malt. And that sort of harkens back to the influence that my mentor played in sort of the development and of both our products as well as the company.
One of the fun things that we wanted to explore too, from just the malt geek perspective is, when we first started working with Oak and Grist, we were working exclusively with 6-row thoroughbred barley. And so, you guys were taking that, I believe it was a mix of pale and heritage at the time when we started. And then as 2-row became more available, we kind of migrated to our Southern Select. And so that transition is represented in these two glasses. So I'm pretty stoked to check that out. So
yeah, our single malt's going to be representative of that 6-row. And then
just to give you all a little color look there.
The blended malt is going to be that 2-row. And we've moved to pretty much only using the 2-row in our whiskey production, and that's really just sort of a processing decision. I mean, the flavor's great in both of them. I actually pulled a little sample behind that single malt is a little sample of the mash that we brewed today.
Cool.
So this hasn't fermented yet, but I just thought that would be an interesting thing.
Oh wow! Yeah,
to take a peek at,
super bready.
Real bready. Definitely some good sweetness coming through with it. So yeah, it's a pretty fun one.
Well, and tell us, those of you at home, you may not be able to see the two colors here. I'll bring the second sample in. So there's a pretty remarkable difference in the color between the two samples here. Can you tell us a little bit about the aging process?
Sure. Yeah. So once a new make whiskey goes into the barrel, it's constantly going through additive and subtractive interactions with that barrel, and every differing aspect of each barrel is going to influence the spirit inside of it differently. So, the size of the barrel, the smaller the barrel, the more surface area you have, so you can get more interaction in a shorter amount of time. You can get different char levels and different toast levels. So those are going to be big players in the color of the spirit, how heavy that char is. The more time spent in a barrel, the more it's going to pull out of that barrel. If it's a new barrel with a fresh char, it's going to pull lots of fresh oak flavor and aroma, as well as a lot of color out of that fresh char, as opposed to a used barrel, which is what our single malt whiskey was aged in, which has already housed bourbon, and that bourbon has pulled a lot of the color out, and so it's going to be a lighter colored whiskey, which doesn't necessarily translate to flavor but it's going to impart a different color.
For those of you looking on, the older sample is actually a dark pale yellow, and the younger spirit that was aged in New American oak is remarkably darker and amber, even though it's much, much younger. So very, very interesting stuff there. And tell us a little bit about your approach to barrel sourcing as well, because that even has kind of a local connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're working with we've worked historically with a couple different cooperages to supply us barrels, and then we've got some fun things in the work potentially with some local wood to impart a little bit more of a regional flavor. But we're actually fortunate to live in this area because a lot of the American oak that goes into barrel making is grown in sort of the southeast area, the Appalachian Mountains, into Missouri and Arkansas, I believe.
Yeah, I believe there's an independent stave like cutting or processing place like right there near Lake Watauga, just about an hour away. So every time I drive by that, I'm just like, this is awesome. Like this is really, a taste of home is what we're getting from these. So. Well, yeah, so which one should we start, oldest to youngest, or do you think it matters?
I mean, I would say let's, the younger is going to actually surprisingly be a little bit more robust, a little bit more on the bourbon profile. So okay. I would say maybe let's start with the single malt and go from there.
Excellent.
So right off the nose, I get, a fair bit of leather. Definitely some grassiness to it.
Big floral character there.
Definitely some floral character.
Yeah, it's even like a like cinnamon spice character kind of jumping out there, like black pepper a little bit.
Yep.
And really lovely. I mean, it's what proof did you bottle this at?
We ended up going into the bottle at 90 proof.
Okay.
So we when it comes to bottling whiskey, slight proof changes can really affect the flavor. And while the smoothness, because you take the alcohol content down at a lower bottling proof, the smoothness is gonna take over a little bit more. We felt like we lost a decent bit of the character at lower proof, so we decided to keep it up at 90. We even played around with having it a little bit higher. Our blended malt whiskeys go in a little bit higher. But yeah, we went in at 90 proof.
Now, at the higher proof, does the spice, or do you pick up? What happens in that pickup there? Did you tamp down some of the cinnamon kind of? I don't want to say burn, but there's definitely like a spicy richness that's like right there up front. Was that too pronounced at like 96 proof or something like that?
Yeah, those are gonna be a little bit more pronounced at higher alcohol contents. A lot of times, there's countless compounds that are created during the whiskey maturation process, and in general, the addition of water to a spirit, whether it be going into a bottle or, you know, we've got these droppers at the distillery. If you want to bring the alcohol content down, those are going to tend to bring out some of your more fruity and floral flavors.
Right. And that second sip is really where your palate's way more amenable to what's going on there. That first one, you know, you got to have that acclimation point.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Particularly if it's the first sip of the day. I like to tell people a lot of times that's really just a throwaway sip.
Yeah, just let your palate wake up.
You don't want to spit it out, but it definitely is waking up the palate and getting it prepared for what's going to keep coming. So.
Because the second round, you start to get more of those sort of sweet aromatics come out, the honey notes come through, and it gets a little softer and rounder and sweeter on the palate. That's really nice, but still, like, and it almost switches to more light bodied to me, you know. So,
and that's really what we were going for with this single malt. My mentor cut his teeth in Speyside, Scotland. Which characteristically is a lighter, more fruity and floral region in Scotland, as opposed to, you know, say the Isle of Skye, your Lafroigs and your Lagavulins, which are going to be real oily and really pack that smoky punch from the peat. Speysides tend to be a little bit more delicate, a little bit more approachable for, you know, say the more novice single malt drinker that's looking to get into scotches or American single malt. A lot of times people's biggest objection is that peat flavor with scotch, but it really ends up being more of a regional thing. So,
you know, I'm warming up to stronger peat notes, but to me, I still like a balance of all of those. You know, I never look for like the peat monsters or anything like that. I want to see where they're all blended together and really sort of taking advantage of the sum of the parts. You know? But that's really lovely, man. I'm excited to see how that turned out. I mean, again, the weight, you know, making the you know, this is probably only the second time, you know, I've had something this old with our malt. You know, the first time was with Wicked Weed's spontaneous fermentation program. So this is one of the first, you know, 3-year-old plus whiskeys that I've tasted with our stuff. So this is really exciting. And so, cool. So that was sample number 1 at 90 proof with the 6 row. Then we're going to move over to the younger spirit, but is in a new barrel.
Yeah, so this one's going to be quite a bit different than what we tried. I mean, you know, what we're finding is that, you know, we always tend to have this sort of chocolatey, leathery undertone to our whiskey, which we quite enjoy. But because we age this in a new American oak barrel with a light char, we're going to get some more of the, you know, those characteristically bourbon spices, you know, more vanilla, things like that. You know, it of course comes with a darker color. This one did go into the bottle at 100 proof, so it's a little bit closer to barrel strength than the single malt. But
really, that's one of my favorite notes in either bourbons or any whiskeys, really, is when it can get that sort of baker's chocolate kind of complexity to it. It's just a nice balance with the hot alcohols, you know, when you can blend those two.
And we were quite taken. Our blended malt whiskeys have pretty much all been single barrel releases, and we were quite taken by this barrel because it offered this really interesting smoky characteristic, despite it not having any smoked malt in it. We sort of get, and it's not so much like peat smoke or hickory smoke or anything like that. It's to us more of like a burnt ends, barbecue-y type smoke to it.
Like just a distant campfire, just like it just kind of wafts across. You know?
Absolutely.
Man, the finish is so lengthy on that too. It's really interesting how it just sort of drifts across. Like it's not just bow, that's 100 proof whiskey. It really.
Yeah, and one of the other fun things about this is, because of that new barrel, because of
That's really awesome.
that level 2 char,
Yeah.
we were able to get a little bit more maturity in the whiskey in a shorter amount of time. So this is actually more than 2/3 younger than that. So this whiskey's coming in at less than a year old, 9 months old. So that's
really surprising. Yeah, that kind of complexity at that age, it's
And that gets into a little bit of sort of where we make our cuts and how narrow our heart's cut is. That we're getting some really lovely young whiskeys. And when I look at our young whiskeys, it to me bodes really well for the future of our older age spirits.
Yeah, and this is where, it's challenging. I can imagine going to market. Like, it's one thing, you've got folks here in the tap room, you can walk through and have this really interesting dialogue, but, I know it's tough at market when you're in the ABC store. I've had distillers tell me I've got 10 seconds to sell a whiskey bottle, and, not being able to blow people away with an age statement. But if they could just try it, they could see, like, it's got some really interesting complexity. I mean, because honestly, and you've probably experienced it with some of the, special release bourbons from the big players. Like, they highlight that chocolate note. Like, if they find that's like a honey barrel and it's, it might be 6 years old coming out of a. So that's really interesting. Really dig that.
Yeah, we're pretty excited about where our whiskey program is right now. And we're real interested in sort of playing around with other distilleries and exchanging barrels and seeing what we can get. I've talked to a few of the larger craft whiskey producers, and there's the potential for some really interesting collaborations in the works too, which, when it comes to the maturation side of things, that's what really interests me is playing around with different things and getting some port and some sherry,
right,
and some we've played around with ex-cider barrels. So the world is really our oyster when it comes to that. Someone recently I was asking folks about what barrels they would like to see us finish some spirits in, and someone mentioned a peated Scotch whiskey barrel.
Okay.
And I thought that might be, that was an interesting comment to sort of bring in some of that peat on a much mellower level, as opposed to, packing it in there with the grain.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're also, one of the things that we love about working with Riverbend and working with craft malt is although some could argue that, the distillery efficiency and all of that could potentially be affected by working with, a smaller batch malt, we actually view that as a benefit because we can have these conversations with you, and
sure,
we can talk about introducing smoke, and we can talk about changing, malting a little bit differently to get the extract levels that we're looking for, so that we actually can be just as efficient as some of the bigger distilleries that are using some of the super large batch malts.
Sure.
So that's a great additive too.
Well, and I think when we talk about putting blending projects together, having that just, hey, one day in 2018, the batch of Southern Select was an SRM different. It was darker and richer and sweeter. Well, maybe if we get sophisticated enough, we can track that back to maybe that was the beginning of a honey barrel. So I think there's going to be some fun things that we can kind of, as our record keeping gets more sophisticated, we can say, oh, look, batch 2012 went into this whiskey and it was an SRM or two darker, or that was the time we played around with the that was a North Carolina barley versus Virginia, you know, that kind of thing. So those are the types of interactions that I'm really looking forward to kind of sussing out as we get deeper into these experiments. So really cool stuff. Well, yeah, tell us what we've got behind the bottles here.
Yeah,
as our third and final taster.
Absolutely. So this is a fun little single barrel thing we got going on. Back in the first year of our production, we put down some rye whiskey. On our equipment, because we're set up to do single malt whiskey, it's a little bit tricky to brew rye because it gets so thick.
Sure.
But after having to siphon grain and liquid out of the top of the mash tun a few times, I finally worked out our large-scale rye recipe and got a couple barrels put down. What we're working with here is a 55% malted rye, 45% malted barley, 100% Riverbend.
Cool.
So by the federal definition, this is a rye whiskey, perhaps a double malt whiskey, depending on how we want to define it. But this is a fun one.
Very cool.
This one is going to be quite a bit different. It's also sitting at barrel proof.
Ooh, okay. Thanks for the heads up.
Yep. So, that's where the dropper comes into play. If you want to add a little bit of water to that, that's going to bring that alcohol content down. But, lots of really nice spice there. This is going to be just shy of 3 years old at this point. For those watching, we'll celebrate 4 years in January, but that means that a lot of our barrels are, less than a little bit less old than we are, so to speak. So this is a really fun one for me. I sort of put this one down and forgot about it because it was just sort of just a couple barrels. But this is a really exciting one for us. People keep asking us about it, and I finally got in there and tried it, and just that classic rye spicy component, I think, really comes through with this.
Absolutely. I mean, it's and then still has that warm sort of caramel note after it hits you right up front with a lot of nice complex spice, and then but then the sweet caramel piece comes through and finishes it out. It's really nice. Sometimes some of the larger producers, the high rye content comes off to me as like almost vegetal. Like, does that make sense? Like almost kind of spinachy in some cases, and I don't really know what to make of that. Like how that comes across. Speaking this, and I think there's some. There's not much in the way of varietal allegiance in the big groups. They're using, a lot of them I've heard are just really their only spec for rye as a plumpness character. They don't even really care what variety it is, and I think that's a missed opportunity. To talk. I mean, so this Carolina rye is made with an heirloom rye called a Bruzy, and that is it's been around the South since the Civil War, and it's we should get some of the Seashore Black in your hands as well.
We should.
Because that's definitely more savory character and lower on the spice, and so I could really see that. And we also did a Munich rye too that would be super fun to play with.
I'm up for all the experimentations.
Yes, yeah. But so that was again kind of one interesting thing. The rye whiskey numbers are going out of the roof. That's 700% sales increase or whatever year over year, but it's just rye. There's no story behind it. It's not malted. It just seems like there's so many chapters to rye whiskey that are yet to be explored. So I'm pumped to see where things go from here. But this is really lovely.
Yeah. So we're hoping we can get around to releasing this sometime around the holidays coming up, but
Right
it might be first part of 2021, and then of course it'll be quite a while before we have another one, since it's been a while since we put some rye down. But
yeah. Well, speaking of holiday releases, can you kind of tell everybody kind of what's out there now and what they can expect coming in the months ahead?
Yeah,
in terms of releases.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a small batch production facility, so a lot of times our releases are finite. We find something interesting and we release it. We've created our single malt whiskey. That is going to be a reoccurring release, but it is going to be limited. So for instance, there were only 521 bottles of this single malt put into bottles.
Nice.
We're probably down to our last 100 or so. They are available
Love this.
in North Carolina. Got to thank North Carolina General Assembly for making it illegal to ship directly to consumers. So unfortunately, you can only get it in North Carolina. So you'll either have to go to an ABC store or come and see us here.
The leaves will be changing soon, so people have got plenty of reason to come and do a road trip here.
Absolutely. And we're actually going to be our blended malt whiskey, the first one that we tried, the second one that we tried, we're actually phasing out our blended malt whiskey in favor of just a malt whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to again be releasing that around the holidays, and that will also be a more steadily available release. We're going to be blending multiple barrels of the same age to be able to give us more volume.
Lovely.
To be able to get it out to the consumers. As I mentioned, we've got the rye. We touched on the gin. We haven't really gone a whole lot into depth on that, but we do have both an unaged and an aged Geneva, although we can't actually say that it's aged. We can only say that it's rested in barrels.
Yes.
And then we've got a few other secret things in the pipeline, hopefully for 2021 that we've been working on during these COVID times.
Right.
That will hopefully expand our product line and yeah.
Nice. Very cool, man. I'm just so stoked and appreciate y'all taking the moments to spend Craft Malt Week with us, and appreciate you being a certified craft malt distillery. And well, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. We're going to wrap up, and we'll see you soon. Happy Craft Malt Week.